Johnny Carson's hand froze mid-gesture when he saw a face in the audience that would make the joke about California gas. Lines die in his throat. Somewhere between the punchline and the applause, his eyes had locked on row 12 left side. And everything else. The teleprompter. Scrolling, Ed leaning forward. Concerned, 300 faces waiting for the laugh faded into background noise. An elderly woman in a red dress sat, clutching a worn leather purse, and Johnny's lips parted not for the scripted line, but for a name he hadn't spoken in 30 years. It was November 14th, 1979. Studio One at NBC Burbank, a Tuesday night that should have been like any other. The monologue card slipped from his fingers, scattering across the desk like leaves. Doc Severson's band held their breath. The audience waited, and the most precisely timed man in television forgot every word he'd practiced. The Tonight Show had become America's bedtime ritual by late 1979. A clockwork machine that delivered 15 million viewers their nightly dose of Johnny Carson at exactly 11:30 p.m. Eastern. Every weeknight, Johnny arrived at NBC's Burbank lot at 5:30 p.m. sharp, parking his Mercedes in the same spot near stage 1, walking the same backstage hallways where crew members knew not to interrupt his pre-show focus. He'd spend exactly 12 minutes reviewing monologue cards with head writer Raymond Siller, check his tie in the dressing room mirror, always adjusted twice, never quite straight enough, and exchanged 3 minutes of practiced small talk with Ed McMahon before the curtain opened. The show's rhythm was so reliable that commercial breaks landed at 2 minutes 20 seconds every time, giving Johnny just enough space to sip water and reset his legendary timing. Camera operators could predict his gestures down to the second. You could set your watch by when Johnny would land a punchline. One floor manager would recall years later. He never missed, not once in 17 years. But precision breaks when something human slips through. That Tuesday began like any other taping day in Studio One. The audience lined up outside at 4 p.m. Tourists from Iowa, retirees from Pasadena, UCLA students hoping to see celebrities up close. Inside, associate producer Peter Lazuli reviewed the night's lineup. A comedian fresh from the Comedy Store, an actress promoting her new detective series, maybe an animal segment if time permitted. Doc Severson's band practiced the opening fanfare, that brassy Tonight Show theme, embedded in America's collective memory. Makeup artists touched up Johnny's face under harsh studio lights that made everyone look slightly orange on film. The air carried its distinctive NBC smell, cigarette smoke layered over industrial carpet cleaner, stale coffee. From the commissary, the particular mustiness of a television studio that never fully aired out. At 5:55 p.m., the warm-up comedian worked the crowd, teaching them when to clap, transforming 300 strangers into a synchronized audience. Ed McMahon settled at his announcer's desk, diet Coke within reach, preparing to boom those famous words into America's living rooms. No one expected the night to become legend. She'd driven 6 hours from Modesto that morning, her daughter navigating the rusted station wagon through traffic while Margaret Henderson clutched her purse in the passenger seat. 73 years old, former English teacher at Norfolk High School in Nebraska, now living on a fixed pension in California's Central Valley. Mrs. Henderson had hesitated when her daughter surprised her with Tonight Show tickets for her birthday. The drive was long. Her arthritis made sitting painful, and she wasn't sure Johnny would even remember the scrawny kid from her 1943 junior English class who couldn't sit still but had something she called natural timing. Still, she'd brought the letter, kept it Folded in her purse for 32 years, the paper thin as tissue now. Johnny's teenage handwriting still visible. Dear Mrs. Henderson, you're the first person who made me think I could be something. Thank you for believing in a messed up kid. Johnny Carson, class of 43. She'd written him dozens of letters over the decades, sent them to NBC, care of The Tonight Show, never expecting replies. Famous people don't answer old teachers. But she'd kept watching, proud and distant, like a mother whose son moved away and forgot to call. The show opened perfectly. Ed's introduction thundered through Studio One. Here's Johnny, and the curtain opened on America's favorite host doing his signature golf swing entrance. The monologue rolled smooth as silk. Jokes about President Carter, the Iranian hostage crisis, California's Proposition 13 tax revolt. Johnny's timing was perfect. Pauses calibrated to the millisecond. Audience responding exactly when expected. He'd mastered the art of talking to millions while making each viewer feel personally addressed. Between jokes, he adjusted his tie, his unconscious tell when material was landing well, and glanced toward Ed for reaction beats, their 30-year partnership visible in every exchanged look. 60 seconds into the monologue, during applause for a bit about rising gas prices, Johnny scanned the audience, an old habit from his early radio days, checking for hot crowd sections to play toward. That's when his eyes stopped moving. Row 12, left side, blue cardigan, white hair pulled back in a bun. A face he'd last seen in 1943, outside Norfolk High School when she'd pressed a $5 bill into his 17-year-old hand and said, "Go West, Johnny. You're too talented for Nebraska." The next joke died in his throat. The teleprompter kept scrolling, but Johnny had stopped reading. Ed noticed first. 3 decades of working together teaches you when something's wrong. The audience shifted in their seats, uncertain whether this pause was part of an unannounced bit. Director Bobby Quinn leaned into his headset in the control booth. "Is he okay?" Camera 2, tighten on his face. Johnny's hand moved to his tie, adjusted it once, twice, 3 times. The familiar ritual transformed into nervous repetition. His eyes hadn't left row 12. Studio lights glared harsh and unforgiving. The band waited for their cue. Mrs. Henderson sat perfectly still, not understanding why Johnny Carson was staring directly at her, why her daughter was gripping her arm, why 15 million viewers were watching silence spread across America's most reliable show. "Maggie," Johnny said so softly the boom microphone barely caught it. Not his stage voice, a teenage boy's voice, cracking with disbelief. The audience assumed it was set up for a sketch. Ed knew it wasn't. He'd seen Johnny perform through broken bones, divorces, his son's death. Johnny never broke character. Never. The cameras kept rolling, but Johnny Carson, the man who never missed a beat, had already stopped performing. Norfolk, Nebraska, 1941. Johnny Carson was a skinny 16-year-old, magic-obsessed underachiever who couldn't sit still in class and made jokes to hide how poor his family was. During the Depression's lingering shadow, Margaret Henderson taught junior English and ran the drama club, one of those teachers who saw potential in difficult students nobody else wanted to deal with. She kept Johnny after class one afternoon, not to discipline him, but to ask if he'd ever considered performing professionally. "You have timing," she told him, watching him fidget with a deck of cards. "Real timing. That's not something anyone can teach you. That's a gift." She loaned him books about vaudeville performers, let him practice comedy routines during lunch period in her empty classroom, wrote him the recommendation letter for the Navy's entertainment program that changed everything. While Johnny rose, Navy shows in the Pacific, radio gigs in Omaha, Los Angeles television, then finally the Tonight Show throne, Mrs. Henderson kept teaching in Norfolk for 30 more years. Her husband died in 1958. Her pension barely covered rent. She moved to California in 1975 to be near her daughter, living in a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Modesto. Grading papers for substitute teaching. Gigs that paid $35 a day. She wrote Johnny 14 letters after moving west, not asking for anything, just letting him know she was proud. None reached him. Lost somewhere in NBC's avalanche of fan mail, filtered by assistants protecting his time. Johnny remained frozen at his desk while 30 seconds of dead air, an eternity in television, stretched across NBC's network. Ed finally stood moving toward Johnny with concern that wasn't performance. "Johnny, you with us, pal?" The audience began murmuring. Mrs. Henderson's daughter whispered urgently, "Mom, what's happening?" But Mrs. Henderson understood first, the recognition hitting both directions simultaneously. Her former student, now the most famous man in television, and she'd never been able to tell him how much those early encouragements had saved her too. How watching his success gave her purpose. Through her husband's death, through lonely years teaching kids who didn't always appreciate her. Bobby Quinn's voice crackled through Johnny's earpiece. "Johnny, we're live coast to coast. Need you back, buddy." Johnny shook his head slowly, then did something no one had ever seen in 17 years of hosting The Tonight Show. He stood up, removed his microphone, and walked off the set toward row 12. Ed tried covering. "Folks, we'll be right back after this commercial break," but Johnny was already moving through the audience, past confused floor managers, past cameras that didn't know whether to follow. Studio 1 fell into cathedral silence. Mrs. Henderson stood on trembling legs as Johnny reached her. And when he arrived, this man who'd interviewed presidents and movie stars with unshakable composure, who commanded millions every night with perfect control, wrapped his arms around a 73-year-old former teacher and buried his face in her shoulder. "I never got your letters," he said, voice breaking. "Maggie, I never knew you were here. I'm so sorry." She held him like he was still 16, still the boy who needed someone to believe in him before he could believe in himself. The studio lights glared down on them. Both 300 audience members watched something more real than any scripted moment. The cameras had stopped rolling. The crew didn't care. Some moments matter more than television. Bobby Quinn sat in the control booth watching monitors show an empty desk, a confused audience, and their star host hugging someone in row 12. His assistant producer frantically signaled they were 90 seconds into an unscheduled commercial break. Advertisers would be furious. Affiliates would demand explanations, but Quinn had worked with Johnny since 1972. He knew the difference between technical difficulties and human emergency. "Extend the break," Quinn ordered. "Bump the actress. Cancel the animal segment. We're going to need time." Peter Lazuli appeared at Johnny's side in the audience, whispered something. Johnny nodded, but didn't let go of Mrs. Henderson. When he finally stepped back, his eyes were red. "Get her backstage," Johnny said quietly. "My dressing room. And Peter, find out how my mail system has been failing for 3 decades. They sat in Johnny's private dressing room, while Ed covered brilliantly on stage, stretching the comedian set, bringing out the actress early. Mrs. Henderson's hands shook as she pulled the letter from her purse, unfolded it with the care of someone handling sacred text. Johnny read his own teenage handwriting, promising to remember the teacher who believed in him and felt the weight of how thoroughly fame had insulated him from people who mattered. First, I wrote you after my husband died, she said softly. When I moved to California, I just wanted you to know I was still proud. Johnny's cigarette burned, forgotten in the ashtray. What else did I miss? Tell me everything. The next morning, Johnny called an emergency meeting with NBC executives. The mail system had been protecting him. Thousands of letters screened, filtered, answered with form responses, or ignored entirely. I want every piece of mail forwarded to my personal office, Johnny demanded. No more filtering. No more protection. He'd already instructed his accountant to set up arrangements. Mrs. Henderson's apartment. He'd handle it. Medical bills. Covered, not charity. Repayment of a decades-old debt. By afternoon, NBC pulled every letter Mrs. Henderson had sent. 14 in 4 years. All stamped. Answered by staff. None had reached Johnny. All should have. December 4th, 1979. Mrs. Henderson returned to the Tonight Show as a guest. Johnny interviewed her properly. Full segment. No interruptions. She told stories about teenage Johnny performing magic tricks in study hall, his terrible geometry grades, how she'd known he'd make something of himself because he could make even the principal laugh. America fell in love with her. At segment's end, Johnny announced a teacher recognition fund. Over the next year, NBC received 47,000 letters about teachers who'd changed lives. Johnny scanned audiences differently after that November night. Not for energy, but for faces that mattered. Mrs. Henderson attended quarterly, always row 12, left side. Johnny always found her during monologue, gave a small wave nobody else understood. She died in 1986, peacefully. At her funeral, Johnny sat in back wearing sunglasses, holding the letter she'd kept for 43 years. He never spoke about it publicly, but everyone who'd been there remembered the night the most. Punctual man in television stopped time for the teacher who started everything. On Johnny's desk for 13 more years, tucked under his monologue cards, sat a photograph. A skinny Nebraska boy, standing beside the teacher who believed in him. He touched it before every show. The briefest pause, the smallest gesture, a promise kept decades too